It started like any other day on the set of The Steve Harvey Show. The usual buzz of producers, lighting technicians, and makeup artists filled the backstage corridors as Steve himself reviewed the day's show rundown with his warm signature grin and lighthearted jokes flying left and right. But there was something different about this particular day, something not even Steve, a man who had seen and heard it all in his decades-long career, could have anticipated. The show's producer, Gloria, came up to him during the final prep meeting and said, "Steve, we have a surprise segment planned for the end of the show. Just trust me, you'll want to sit down for it." Steve raised an eyebrow. "Now hold up, Gloria. The last time you surprised me on air, I ended up hugging a snake and screaming like a schoolgirl." She laughed. "It's not that kind of surprise. This one's meaningful." Steve nodded, curious but trusting. He always gave his producers a little creative freedom as long as the audience got something real, honest, and heartfelt. That was his brand after all, keeping it real. The taping began like any other. The audience was hot, clapping and laughing in sync as Steve did his usual monologue about family, relationships, and the occasional roast of someone's questionable dating habits. Midway through the show, he welcomed on a single mom from Kansas who had just opened a bakery, then brought out a young man who had turned his life around after serving time in prison. But it was the final segment right after the commercial break that changed the tone of the day and eventually made headlines across America. As the show returned from break, the lights dimmed just slightly and the monitors around the studio lit up with the presidential seal, modified for media use, of course. The audience murmured in surprise, a few even gasping. Steve looked up, clearly confused. What's going on here, y'all? This ain't the White House press briefing room." Then, a video began playing on the main screen. Karoline Leavitt, the 30-something press secretary serving under President Donald Trump in his second term, appeared on screen. She was seated at the iconic White House press room podium, dressed sharply in a navy blazer and her signature confidence. But there was a softness in her eyes, a kind of earnestness that was rare in Washington. "Good afternoon, Steve," she began, smiling warmly. "I know this might be a surprise, but I wanted to take a moment, not just on behalf of the administration, but for me personally, to say something that I believe the American people deserve to hear." The room fell silent. Steve sat back in his chair, eyes fixed on the screen, arms crossed but his posture unusually still. Karoline continued, "Over the past few years, this country has seen division, discord, and so much noise. But amid it all, voices like yours, voices of truth, humor, family, and faith, have kept many of us grounded. I may serve in the political arena now, but I grew up in a household where we watched the Steve Harvey Show religiously. My father used to say that man's got wisdom tucked inside those jokes." The audience laughed softly, but Steve didn't move. His mouth was open slightly as if he'd forgotten he was still on camera. Karoline's tone shifted, growing more intimate. "I remember being 16 years old, watching one of your shows where you comforted a teenage girl who had lost her parents. You didn't just host her. You held her hand, cried with her, and told her she was going to be okay. I remember thinking, if people like that are on TV, maybe the world isn't as broken as it seems." Steve blinked rapidly. He was trying to maintain his composure, but even he couldn't deny the knot forming in his throat. Karoline smiled gently. "So thank you, Steve. Thank you for being a father figure to millions of Americans who never had one. For showing strength in vulnerability. For laughing through pain. And for reminding us that sometimes the most important work we do isn't the most glamorous, it's just being there for someone." Then, before the screen faded to black, she added one last message. "From the bottom of my heart, thank you. You've changed more lives than you'll ever know." As the screen went dark, the room was silent. Not a cough, not a whisper, not even the rustling of audience members shifting in their seats. And then the camera zoomed in slowly on Steve. His eyes were glassy. He opened his mouth, tried to speak, and then paused. Finally, he whispered, "Lord have mercy." A single tear rolled down his cheek. The cameras cut to commercial, but the energy in the room didn't shift. Steve remained seated, unusually quiet, gently dabbing his eyes with a tissue. He wasn't a man who cried easily, not publicly, at least. But this moment had pierced through layers of showmanship, comedy, and television polish. It was real. It was raw. Gloria rushed toward him from backstage. "Steve, are you okay?" He looked up, smiled softly, and shook his head in disbelief. "Man, I ain't never had nobody from the White House say anything like that to me. That girl. Karoline, she meant that. You could feel it." The studio audience began clapping, not loud, forced claps for show ratings, but the kind of appreciative applause that comes when people have just witnessed something meaningful. Some even stood. They weren't just applauding Steve. They were applauding the shared humanity of the moment. As Steve walked off stage during the break, staff members and crew members hugged him, one after the other. His longtime cameraman, Marcus, leaned in and whispered, "Boss, my mama called you her TV husband for 20 years. She would have been hollerin' at that message." Steve chuckled through his tears. TV husband? Man, don't get me started. The segment went viral almost immediately. Clips from the broadcast hit social media within minutes. One Twitter/X post featuring Steve's tearful reaction had racked up over 10 million views by sunset. Hashtags like #CarolineandSteve, #RealTalkTV, and #White House Message were trending across the country. Even critics of the Trump administration had to admit the message was moving. Liberal commentator Joy Behar said on The View, "Look, I may not agree with this administration on anything, but that moment on Steve Harvey's show? That was class. I'll give Karoline Leavitt credit. She spoke like a human being." Fox News host Jesse Waters went even further. "That's what Americans want to see, two people from totally different worlds, different generations coming together on the basis of respect. That's the tone we need more of in this country." Cable news panels dissected the message line by line. Political commentators debated whether the segment had been spontaneous or orchestrated. But for the average American, those questions didn't matter. What mattered was the sight of a beloved TV host, someone people had grown up watching every afternoon, getting honored for something more than just entertainment. Steve himself didn't post much online afterward. His only message was a single tweet that read, "Didn't expect to cry on live TV today. But when truth hits your spirit, you gotta let it out. Thank you at Cleveland, I needed that." By the end of the day, Steve's team had received over 5,000 emails, letters, and voicemails. Many came from young adults who'd grown up with him on their TVs, or from single moms who used his advice to raise their kids, or from fathers who had sat down and cried with their sons watching one of his inspirational speeches. But it wasn't just the fans who noticed. Within 24 hours, the White House press office issued a follow-up statement confirming that the message from Karoline had been recorded without any prior publicity. It was her idea. She wanted to express personal gratitude, the statement read. And she believed Steve Harvey represented a unique voice in American culture that deserved to be acknowledged. President Trump himself was later asked about the moment during an impromptu Q&A outside the White House. "Steve Harvey?" Trump said, smiling. "I like the guy. Funny. Great voice. My press secretary tells me he's got heart. I watched the clip," he cried. "That was beautiful. I think more people should cry on TV. It's authentic." Reporters laughed, but beneath the president's trademark bravado, there was no doubt the message had landed. It had struck something deeper in the country's psyche, something that transcended politics. Karoline Leavitt, usually known for her tough press briefings and combative defense of White House policy, had shown a different side. For once, she wasn't the fierce political gladiator. She was a citizen, a daughter, a fan. And that moment of vulnerability turned her into something rare, a political figure who could move people, not just argue with them. Meanwhile, on the next day's episode, Steve addressed the audience again. "I'm gonna say this one time, and I hope y'all hear me good," he began. "We live in a world right now where it's easy to yell, easy to fight, easy to tear each other down. But yesterday, a young woman stood up and gave me my flowers while I could still smell That's love, y'all." The crowd roared with applause. And whether you like her politics or not, that ain't even the point. The point is, you never know who you're reaching. You never know who's watching your life. You might be changing somebody you'll never even meet. That line alone would become a viral soundbite, reposted on TikTok, turned into motivational Instagram reels, and even printed on t-shirts by fans. 2 days after the emotional broadcast, Karoline Leavitt walked into the White House press room with her usual confident stride. The podium, the flashing cameras, the barrage of questions, none of it fazed her. But today, the energy in the room was different. Reporters weren't just looking for soundbites or press gaffes. They were looking at her, really looking. They had seen something new in the viral clip from the Steve Harvey show. And they wanted to understand the why behind it. Karoline, a CNN journalist, asked, "What prompted you to deliver such a heartfelt message to Steve Harvey on national television? Was this a political strategy or a personal statement?" Karoline smiled, brushing a lock of hair behind her ear before leaning into the mic. "It was personal. Deeply personal," she said. "You know, people see the press secretary as just a mouthpiece, a policy machine. But I'm still a person, just like every American watching that show." She paused, then continued more softly. "When I was growing up in Atkinson, New Hampshire, my mom worked 2 jobs and my dad was a machinist. We didn't have much, but we had each other. And every night, right before dinner, my mom would turn on reruns of the Steve Harvey Show. I remember the way she laughed harder than she did all day. That show was a small light during some tough times. The room fell quiet as she went on. I watched Steve be more than funny, he was kind. Honest. He didn't just entertain, he taught people how to carry themselves with dignity. And when my father passed away unexpectedly my senior year of high school, I remember sitting on the couch one night, watching a rerun where Steve told a young man, "You might have lost your father, but you didn't lose your future." Her voice caught slightly, just enough for the room to notice. I never forgot that. I carried it with me to college, to Capitol Hill, and even here, in the White House. The press corps, usually so combative and skeptical, sat still. Respectful. Moved. Across the country, Americans were beginning to see Karoline Leavitt in a new light. She was no longer just the sharp-tongued defender of Trump's policy agenda. She was a woman with a story, one that mirrored so many others. In New York, a group of single mothers organized a digital meetup called Flowers While We Can, inspired by her words. In Houston, a high school principal held an assembly showing the clip of Steve Harvey's tearful reaction, encouraging students to recognize their mentors and role models. Even within the West Wing, aides and staffers began sharing their own stories about the people who shaped them, teachers, neighbors, coaches, and yes, even celebrities who felt like family from a TV screen. The moment had sparked a cultural ripple. And Steve? He was still absorbing it all. 3 days after the broadcast, he invited Karoline to appear on the show, this time in person. She accepted. The anticipation for the taping was through the roof. The studio audience was triple its usual size. Online ticket demand skyrocketed. Every network was watching. When Karoline walked onto the set that Friday afternoon, the crowd gave her a standing ovation. She wore a soft blue dress and a humble smile. Steve stood at center stage, arms wide open. Well, he said, grinning. "Ladies and gentlemen, y'all give it up for the one woman who made a grown man cry on live TV. Miss Karoline Leavitt." The audience roared. They hugged warmly, and when they sat down, there was a comfortable familiarity between them, like a niece catching up with her favorite uncle. "Karoline," Steve began, "you caught me off guard. I wasn't expecting that. I done seen a lot in this world, but I ain't never had nobody from the White House say nothing like what you said to me." She smiled. "Well, you gave my family something special during hard times. I thought it was time someone gave that back to you." Steve nodded slowly. "You know what, though? I think that moment reminded a lot of folks out there, doesn't matter what color you are, where you from, or what side of the aisle you're on, kindness still matters." Karoline looked at him sincerely. "It does. And when people see kindness from people they least expect it from, it changes everything." That episode would go on to become the highest-rated broadcast in the history of the Steve Harvey Show. But more than ratings, it left an impact. People began writing into the show not just to praise the moment, but to share their own stories, teachers thanking students, veterans honoring nurses, kids thanking grandparents. America had paused just for a moment to give out its flowers. In the days that followed Karoline Leavitt's in-person appearance on the Steve Harvey Show, something remarkable began to unfold across America. It started small. A few video compilations on social media, young people tagging their mentors with the hashtag give them their flowers, and talk radio hosts opening their shows with monologues about gratitude. But it didn't stop there. Local TV stations in places like Des Moines, Milwaukee, and Savannah began airing thank you segments, everyday Americans sharing emotional shout-outs to teachers, pastors, nurses, and even janitors who had made a difference in their lives. One clip that went viral featured a group of high school seniors in Detroit surprising their 67-year-old custodian with a wall-sized mural of him in the school hallway. "He's our Steve Harvey," one student said proudly on camera. "Always dropping wisdom while cleaning up our messes." Talk of the moment even reached Sunday pulpits and church altars. In Atlanta, Bishop Cedric Thomas of New Light Ministries used the message as the anchor for his sermon. "The world saw Steve Harvey cry," he thundered to his congregation. And it wasn't weakness, it was release. That's what happens when grace catches you off guard. The congregation stood and clapped in unison, many of them wiping tears from their eyes. Even in the White House briefing room, a new tone had subtly emerged. The press, still as relentless as ever, seemed to afford Karoline a little more space, a little more humanity. She wasn't just the political mouthpiece anymore, she was a woman who had, in a brief window, spoken directly to the hearts of millions. But there were also skeptics. Some political analysts on cable news, particularly on left-leaning networks, questioned whether the moment was too perfectly timed. Is this the soft rebranding of the Trump administration's image? One MSNBC guest asked. Or is this just one staffer genuinely connecting with someone she admired? Others argued the sincerity of the message didn't necessarily excuse controversial policies the administration had supported. She can cry and compliment a TV host, one columnist wrote, but she's still part of an administration making hardline decisions. Still, the overwhelming public response was positive and personal. Steve Harvey's show saw a dramatic spike in viewership, drawing in younger audiences and reaching even non-traditional markets. He was invited to speak on a panel at Howard University about cultural impact and emotional authenticity in media. And Karoline? She was now being considered for high-profile interviews by outlets that had never requested her before: 60 Minutes, The Atlantic, even Oprah Daily. One night, a primetime town hall aired across multiple networks titled Voices of Gratitude, America Reflects. Steve Harvey co-hosted it alongside Karoline. The event was held in a public auditorium in Dallas, Texas, and brought together teachers, community leaders, veterans, and families who had been inspired by the original segment. The final panel of the night featured a teenage boy named Caleb from Memphis. His voice trembled as he spoke. "I never really knew my dad," he began. "But my mom used to make me watch Steve Harvey. Said he reminded her of the way my granddad used to talk. And it helped me believe I wasn't alone. That I could still be something." Karoline, seated on stage next to Steve, leaned forward and gently touched Caleb's arm. "You will be something," she said, voice firm but warm. "You already are." The audience erupted into a standing ovation. Later that night, backstage, Steve and Karoline stood in the quiet glow of the dressing room lights, taking a moment to breathe after the whirlwind of applause. Steve turned to her, voice low and gravelly. "Karoline, I gotta admit, when I first saw you up there in that press room, I figured you were just another tough-talking politico. But now," he smiled, "you're the real deal." Karoline returned the smile, but her eyes held something deeper. "It's funny, Steve. People always think politics is about shouting louder than the other side. But sometimes it's about whispering truth in a way people can finally hear." Steve nodded slowly, letting her words sink in. "I think we just started something," he said. Weeks turned into months, but the emotional ripple of that one televised moment between Steve Harvey and Karoline Leavitt didn't fade, it deepened. Universities across the country began hosting flowers and forgiveness events. What started as a college campus trend, students taking the mic to thank professors, coaches, and mentors, soon evolved into a nationwide initiative. Public parks, community centers, even jails began hosting open mic nights where Americans from all walks of life came forward to acknowledge those who had changed the trajectory of their lives. Even politicians, typically slow to show public emotion, took note. At a bipartisan leadership conference held in Denver, a surprising image surfaced: Republican Senator Tim Scott and Democratic Senator Cory Booker seated side by side, recording a joint video thanking their mothers. It opened with Booker saying, "You know, after watching Steve Harvey break down on TV, it reminded me we don't say thank you enough," and ended with both men laughing, holding framed childhood photos. Across the nation, the Steve Karoline moment had become a cultural checkpoint, a rare touchstone of grace in an increasingly divided America. But for Steve Harvey, the story wasn't over. Behind the scenes, Steve began developing a foundation in partnership with Karoline Leavitt called the Flowers Project. Its mission was simple: to encourage youth, especially those from underserved communities, to publicly honor their role models and to support those role models with resources, education grants, and recognition. Karoline threw her full support behind it. Despite her packed White House schedule, she made time to appear at key events, often skipping political galas to speak at high schools and church groups. One of the most powerful of those events came in the form of a quiet visit to an elementary school in Mississippi, an area hard hit by generational poverty. Karoline and Steve sat on tiny chairs in a third-grade classroom, watching as a little girl named Alana stood up with a note in her hand. To Miss Rivera, Alana read nervously, "Thank you for buying me lunch when I didn't have no money and for saying I'm smart even when I got stuff wrong. You're my real mom at school." Tears streamed down the teacher's face. The other students clapped. Steve turned away from the cameras, quietly wiping his eyes again. Later, in an emotional interview with Time magazine, Steve reflected on what had changed in him since that fateful broadcast. "I've had fame, money, all that stuff people think you're supposed to chase," he said. "But when Karoline looked into that camera and told me that I helped her through losing her daddy, man, that's a kind of wealth I never knew I needed. She gave me flowers, and now I get to help give them to others." For Karoline, the journey had taken on a life of its own. She began to be recognized not just for her role behind the White House podium, but as a symbol of a new kind of leadership, one that didn't rely solely on facts and fire, but on heart. Political pundits debated what her future might hold. Some speculated a Senate run, others wondered if she'd one day become the first female Republican presidential nominee. But when asked directly during a CBS sit-down if she had political ambitions beyond her current role, she answered plainly, "I don't think about the next title. I think about the next life I can speak into. If one man crying on TV can spark this much love, imagine what we could do if we all led with that kind of courage." And America listened. The final tribute came nearly 6 months after the original broadcast. The Steve Harvey Show aired a special 1-hour primetime edition titled The Heart of the Matter. Guests included Karoline, Caleb from Memphis, Miss Rivera, and several others who had become central figures in the movement. At the end of the show, Steve walked onto the stage holding a small bouquet of white roses. He turned to Karoline, who sat smiling beneath the warm glow of the stage lights. "I've said thank you 1,000 times," he began, voice steady but full. "But tonight, I want to do what you did for me." He handed her the flowers. "You've been strong in a job that eats most people alive. You showed compassion in a world that rewards coldness. And you reminded me, and this country, that kindness isn't weakness, it's leadership." The crowd stood, clapping, cheering, some weeping. Karoline, visibly moved, accepted the flowers and stood to hug him. In that moment, on a national stage, surrounded by lights, applause, and a silent thread of unity, America saw something rare. Two people from different worlds, bound by gratitude, reshaping a culture that had forgotten how powerful simple words can be. "Thank you." The credits rolled not over music, but over the soft voices of school children reading thank you notes aloud. From a boy in Detroit to his football coach. From a daughter in Tampa to her single dad. From a nurse in Phoenix to the janitor who never missed a day of work. The legacy had taken root. And in living rooms across the country, millions of viewers wiped away tears of their own. Not because of politics, not because of policy, but because for the first time in a long time, they felt something real.